Okay, so we are moving along here. We're making some headway in Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine. We're up to chapter 24 here, Matter. This is on page 246. So as we have seen, we have moved through, as we're going down, this is tracking the descent of consciousness as it involutes and hides itself in the physical world. We've gone down from mind, tracking it down through life, down into matter, because instead of starting, as in Kundalini Yoga, with the lower chakras, the Muladhara, which is the root base, which is the chakra that has to do with matter, let's say, and then ascending upwards, keep in mind that Aurobindo starts from above and has the supramental descend downwards. So he moves in the opposite direction to most of the Indian thinkers, where Satchidananda, using the supermind, has incarnated itself downward. So we go down through, and he recommends this too, through yoga. If you're going to do yoga, don't start with the Kundalini model of ascent through the lower animal energies, the Svadhisthana, the genitals, the Manipura, the aggression, because you could get stuck in those. So it's better to get to those going the other way, starting with the descent of the consciousness, the supernal consciousness, downward through the upper chakras. Work your way through those first so that you're strong enough to be built up to handle the vital energies. So he turns the model upside down. So that's what he's doing here. So now the problem with matter is that it puts up all this inertial resistance against life, just as life and matter put up resistance against mind. So there's always these forms of resistance. And you might even say, though he doesn't say this explicitly, he implies it, that with regard to the three gunas in Sankhya, tamas guna, which is inertia, rajas guna, which is fiery, passionate activity, and sattva guna, which has to do with clarity of mind, we might say that matter is tamas guna. It is inertia. It's like the ass in Lucius Apuleius' Golden Ass. Matter is like where it's meant to personify the lower instincts. We're always dragging it along, and it's always resisting us with its limitations. It has its victories over life through death, but it's really a secret continuance to add in more lives. So it keeps going that way, but it's always resistance. And then life itself would then correspond to rajas, fear and desire, fiery, passionate activity, and mind, at least in potential, corresponds to sattva, the attainment through yoga of luminous clarity. And so that's basically what this chapter, which introduces the topic of matter, discusses. But as he says, matter, keep in mind, is a veiled form of spirit. It is still spirit. It's just disguised in a very dense, heavy, low vibrational way. Okay, so then in the next chapter, we get into this issue, chapter 25, called the knot of matter. And there's a threefold knot, which has to do with the opposition that matter presents to spirit, and it does so in three ways. And the first of those ways is ignorance, avidya, because consciousness within us has forgotten the consciousness that it once was. So there's been a massive separation and the illusion, whereas matter has the tendency to aggregate and build up. Mind has the tendency, as we have seen, to divide. And so it forgets its divine origins, like the Gnostic myth of the hymn of the pearl, where a being from another world has been sent on a mission to come down to the earth and discover his divine origins. But, of course, as happens with all of us, when we incarnate, we get a memory wipe. So he doesn't remember his mission, and he goes to Egypt, and he gets lost in the luxuries of the senses, food and sex and luxury and all these things, and he forgets his divine origins. And then he has to be sent out on a mission to find the pearl, which is, of course, the symbol for the soul. Same idea here is that avidya is the memory wipe that we get when we come into being. We forget our divine origins, and it's the task of us to remember it, to find it, to reconnect consciousness with consciousness, which is what yoga means, to yoke consciousness to a higher consciousness. And then the second fundamental opposition that matter offers to spirit is the culmination of matter's bondage to mechanical laws. Matter has lost its freedom. As it has descended down and hidden itself, it's lost itself to freedom. And once again, let's take another look. We already glanced at Arthur Young's model, but his visuals sort of, because it's the same basic idea, only he substitutes light in place of Satchidananda. But it's the same basic idea. First, this idea of avidya, of forgetting, can be illustrated with his model here, which is the from his book, The Reflexive Universe, where we can see that light now on the left arc is at the top. That's light. And light has complete freedom, 3 degrees of freedom, no constraint whatsoever. Time, space, and mass really don't exist for it. And then there's a bondage and fall as it sinks into the binding, the principle of binding at the second level there with subatomic particles. Now it's lost 1 degree of freedom and gained 1 degree of constraint. And then it falls again to the next level with atoms, where atoms across the periodic table of elements each develop their own identity. So the principle of identity begins to come in, but now we have another loss of a degree of freedom. So we have 1 degree of freedom and 2 degrees of constraint. And then finally at the bottom there, the nadir of the forgetting process, the avidya with molecules and molecular compositions. No freedom whatsoever, 3 degrees of constraint, exactly the opposite situation that it began with light. 3 degrees of constraint, 0 degrees of freedom there. So that would be his first idea, that matter forgets through, the consciousness rather forgets its divine origins and becomes so trapped in matter, like the character in The Hymn of the Pearl who can't remember his divine origins. Now he has to remember it. So as it ascends up to the next level there, which is level 5, plants regain 1 degree of freedom because they have the ability to grow vertically. That's 1 degree of freedom that they managed to reattain. Just as atoms across the way there also had 1 degree of freedom. And then animals at level 6 there regain 2 degrees of freedom, just as subatomic particles had 2 degrees of freedom. So there's a regaining as evolution proceeds through these levels. Animals can move in a 360 degree radius, so they have 2 degrees of freedom. And then finally at the top there, level 7, what he calls dominion, is human consciousness. And it's where human consciousness is what manages to reattain the full 3 degrees of freedom that light once had. And so so that corresponds basically in a much more concrete sort of materialistic way to the model that Auobindo is presenting here. Matter, consciousness descending into matter, has to obey causality, machinic law, as he puts it. And then the third thing that separates matter and spirit is this idea of the culmination of the principle of division. Division, as we have seen, is what matter is all about. Strife between organisms, strife between everything is in a state of division and disunification on the physical plane. So matter then puts up these forms of resistance to spirit in the form of inertia, ignorance, and division. So this is the problem. This is the knot of matter. So that's the chapter on the knot of matter. And then we get to chapter 26, where we get to the ascending series of substance. So what happens then is that, as we have seen in Jung's model there, there's an ascending series of substances. Once the fall happens, consciousness is trapped in matter, and then it moves up through the grades. It moves from matter to life to mind, and in each case as it does so, it moves from more dense to gradually less dense, or less subtle to gradually more and more subtle forms of consciousness. And we can see this by reference to, once again, to Arthur Young's model, only in this case, the model that he uses as his grid, which is his larger model here. And this is his grid that's 7-fold, going down into the 7 stages, and that go across, each one of the stages goes across into 7. So at the top left there we have light, which has 3 degrees of freedom, no symmetry, and the potential, it signifies the principle of potential, no mass, outside of space and time, quanta of action, and hierarchy. And then as it goes across there, from cosmic rays to gamma rays, X-rays, visible light, microwaves, TV and radio waves, low frequency waves, even light itself goes through a process of etherealization as it goes across the spectrum. Then the next level down with nuclear, we have the process, the principle of binding, substance and force, the spell aspect of image, probability fog, of course, the light wave probability issue, 2 degrees of freedom now. And then he leaves that blank going across the way there. And then at the third level, we have atoms, which now have 1 degree of freedom. This is the principle of identity. They acquire their own center. And we get the periodic table of elements going across the way there, where the elements become more and more complex as you go down those 7 rows. Then we have the complete fall at the level of molecules, where we have 0 degrees of freedom. And this is the principle of combination, molar properties, and classical physics. First with metals, then with salts, then with non-functional compounds, functional compounds, polymers, which, as you can see, molecular chemistry getting more and more complex, proteins, which are chains with side chains, and then finally DNA and viruses. So even there's a process of an ascent of substances, just as we have an ascent of substances here going from light to human consciousness. And then with the fifth, we have the vegetable world, which reattains 1 degree of freedom. This is the principle of growth. It begins with single-celled bacteria, goes through algae, embryophytes, silophytales, calamites, which note represent the principle of polymerization or segmentation, just like the polymers above it on the molecular level. Then we have gymnosperms, in other words, trees, and then finally flowers, which represent the principle of dominion within the vegetable world. Then we have at 6, the animal, which reattains 2 degrees of freedom. This is the principle of mobility now. Maximum mobility, which begins with protists, then moves to things like sponges, then coelenterids. Coelenterids have 1 organ, whereas sponges have many cells. Then to many organs with mollusks, 1 chain with worms, annelids. That's back to the principle of polymerization and segmentation. And then chains with side chains, arthropods, and then finally vertebrates, which are the dominion level of the animal kingdom. And then finally 7 with dominion, we have human consciousness with 3 degrees of freedom. So just like Aurobindo's model here, it moves from matter to life to mind. And it's an ascending series of substances, which I think makes it quite a bit more clear than Aurobindo's rather vague model about this. And then so in a certain sense, you can think of it as the opposition between the 2 Hindu words for substance, Stula and Sushma. Stula refers to physical matter, gross matter, which is illuminated externally and changes form slowly in accordance with the law of cause and effect, whereas Sushma is subtle matter, which is self-luminous. It glows. Myths and dreams are self-luminous. The higher levels of the supramental are self-luminous. So evolution itself recapitulates this on the physical plane, this movement from Stula matter gradually with the advent of mind, and animals have basic mind, and moving upward and upward to the neocortex, where mind gets more and more subtle, more and more capable of Sukshma-like events. And then he starts talking about how, though, at the level of mind, even our physical bodies, we're not just stuck, we're not just bound at the level of our physical bodies with purely physical substance, because he says the Hatha yogins of the past have figured out. He mentions the Vedanta. We've gone through the Vedanta before, but it's worth taking another glance at it since he mentions it, where the self is contained within these 5 different sheaths, which can be correlated with 3 different bodies. The physical body, the gross body, is at the top, the Annamaya Kosha, the sheath made of food. And then the subtle body is composed of 3 internal sheaths, the pranamaya kosha, the manomaya kosha, the vijnanamaya kosha, and then finally we have the causal body, which is the anandamaya kosha, or the sheath made of bliss. And all of those surround the self with these outer layers. So we're not just stuck at the human level with a concrete physical body and that's all there is to it, because as far as Aurobindo is concerned, there is something that corresponds to not just the physical, but to what he calls the subtle physical. And then he, for the first time in the book, then he also mentions the chakras, because he retains the model of the chakras. For some reason, he says the yogis of the past discovered 6 centers of life and mind faculty in the subtle, but I suppose that he does not refer to the Sahasrara chakra, the one at the top, and he's talking about the other 6, which are, as far as he is concerned, actual. They are real. And so let's take a look at his model of the chakras here. So we have the chakras, where notice that, unlike the traditional system of the chakras, the Kundalini is not beginning at the bottom there, at the root base, the Muladhara, and ascending through the genitals at the Svadhisthana, and the power complex at the level of the solar plexus there with the Manipura, and then the heart chakra, Anahata, and then the throat chakra, Vishuddha, and then the third eye, the pineal gland, let's say, chakra of Agya, and then the crown of the skull with the Sahasrara. That would be the traditional direction of these yogis, awakening the Kundalini and having it travel through these chakras, which do exist within the physical body, but on a subtle plane. This is the subtle physical, not the gross physical. And so he has divided this. Notice that the arrow then descends from the top going down, which is what he calls there the superconscient. So that's the superconscient, and then the next 2 chakras, the Agya chakra and the Vishuddha chakra, are mental. So he's got mind there, and then he's got the vital, corresponding to the heart chakra, down to the Manipura, down to the genitals. Those are the vital energies. So we go from, once again, as the book has gone this way, from mind to vital, and down all the way to the material, which is the Muladhara, the root base, which is at the level of the perineum, which is the subconscious, the purely physical, or the subconscious. And so he says that we even have access to these subtle energies within us, which can be tapped into through yoga. We're not just stuck with a purely physical body. So there are all these grades of substance that ascend, and that enable us to ascend, to get back up toward the higher levels, the supramental, and then ultimately beyond that, there are all kinds of planes, Brahma Loka, all the other lokas that are above it, where the gods live, and so forth. So that brings us up to speed then to this point for Aurobindo, and then next we'll look at the sevenfold chord of being, chapter 27.